So welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. We're right here at the top of the hour and we have a considerable amount of information to get through in this session. So welcome to you all. I am the facilitator. My name is Sarah Ward and I'm here working with the SEAT network. And I will be introducing our panelists and facilitating and moderating our discussion today. What I would like to do is to get started right on time. So there are going, but I think I'd like to get us started so we don't lose out on the opportunity to get through all of the fascinating information and earth-shattering learning we're going to do here today. The first thing I would like to do is introduce the panelists and the sort of experts that we have with us today. I'm very pleased to say that we have Martina Krailsheim, who is the Director of Savings Groups and Linkages for Vision Fund. We have with us Angeline Manzara, who is the Livelihoods Global Sector Lead for World Vision. And we're going to advance this slide so you'll have a chance to match the faces that you see up at the top of your screen with the names of the folks I'm sharing. So the slides are mildly delayed, so you may see us sort of talking before the thing pops up, so be patient. It will all happen. Wes Wasson is here with us as well, and he is the CEO and co-founder of Dream Start Labs, which is a digital enterprise working across Africa and Asia and Latin America. And he'll be here talking about a digital product that's really important to this conversation. And finally, we have Catherine Teitz, who is the Global Director. She has a very long title. Here we go. She's the Global Director of Humanitarian Partnerships, Cash and Vouchers, and Disaster Management for World Vision. And she'll be closing us out. We have for you today, we can go to the next slide, and we have for you today a session that combines both information for you as well as activities that we're going to do together. So I'd like to present this as a journey, and that's what we're going to do together over the next hour and a half. And our journey begins with stories and the storytelling of the people who are affected in building financial resilience through collaboration, right? And when we talk about building financial resilience through collaboration, and we're looking at both cash and digital pieces, there are people at the center of this. The people who are building their financial resilience and using these cash and digital solutions are individuals. And we're going to hear the stories of some of those individuals. As you saw in that first title slide, the concept of a savings group becomes very important in our conversation today. And we're going to learn a lot more about what savings groups are and how they can be real powerhouses in enabling cash and digital resilience and collaboration. So the first thing we're going to learn about as we talk to our colleagues Martina and Angie are what happens to savings groups and their members when a crisis, when a humanitarian crisis hits. What did we learn about that experience that we didn't know before? What new data do we now have, right? And that's going to frame the first part of our journey together. The second part of our journey together is going to be an activity that we do. And we're going to use a tool called a Mentimeter. And this activity is about what do we think about this information? What do we think about our own experiences? What have we learned? What do we already know? And that's when this whole group on the call here together, all 43 of us, will be able to experience and make decisions and share our information. And we'll use a Mentimeter activity for that. And then we'll move into the third and final part of our conversation, which will really be the last two presenters when we hear from Wes and Catherine. And this will be about how will this transform what we do. So the information that we learned, the journey, the voyage, the story we heard about the participants and the people at the center of this, and then our own experiences. And then how will that change? What could that mean for us going forward, right? What are some new organizations we could be engaging with? What are some new actions we could be taking? And what connections between us might need to be reinforced and rethought for that to work. So that's the journey we're going to go on together. And to frame this for us, to really give us an overarching sense of what this means, I'd like to turn to Catherine, who will give us a bit of a view, and then we'll turn to Angie, who will really give us a masterclass in less than 2 minutes on what a savings group is. So Catherine, why don't you take it from us now to give us some framing, and then we'll hear from Angie afterwards.
Thank you so much and welcome everyone. I think we're all quite familiar with the topic of cash transfers. I assume lots of colleagues from the humanitarian sector are on this group right now in the webinar. And many of you know that cash is essential as a starting point very often in humanitarian assistance in conflict and disaster affected contexts. We have seen a massive growth. $5.6 billion US was the portfolio in 2019 accounted for global cash transfers, but we know there's a lot that was not actually reported, so it's much bigger now, in particular after the start of 2020 and the exponential growth of the need to actually shift money and support social protection mechanisms globally with social assistance transfers to affected populations because of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see on the left-hand side of this graph, this is 2019, the number of government to persons mobile transfers actually exponentially grew. The number of mobile accounts that were receiving these government to person transfers as part of social assistance quadrupled in June 2020 in comparison to 2019 September. So with this in mind, it is quite surprising that we still just think of cash transfers as a tool for humanitarian contexts and for humanitarian basic survival needs. How can cash transfers and the tool of digital registration shift actually the way we work for longer term recovery and development work? How do we see that cash and voucher as well as digital tools help us to transcend all these different contexts, what we call the nexus? I would like to hand over to my colleague Angie, who's very well placed to just explain very briefly to you what we would define as a savings group. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I would like to explain, Sarah said a 2-minute high-level Pecha Kucha lecture about this informal safety net called savings groups. So savings groups are self-selecting and they are member-owned, and they are composed of small number of people who do save together in a safe, convenient, and flexible way, guided by a constitution which they all agree to. And cash is lent to members as credit and payable at an agreed interest rate. Let's move on to the next slide. So savings group membership of 15 to 25 people is highly recommended, as the group size has to be large enough to accumulate a useful amount into the fund, but small enough to encourage social cohesion amongst the members. These groups are less risky, as members must be able to save just small amounts on a regular basis. And these small amounts can be borrowed on flexible terms agreed to by members of the group, either for investment, for consumption, or for emergencies. And in addition to a loan fund, integral to savings groups is a separate social insurance fund, which provides a buffer to members during emergencies and in times of need. Savings groups are also time-bound, and they run from a 9-month to a 12-month cycles, and this simplifies the management of the fund to provide an easy exit and entry point for new members, and also an opportunity to elect a different management committee for the groups. And what members do is to share out at the end of the 9 or 12-month cycle, and they can either agree to share all or part of the accumulated savings and loan profits. But there are also other additional benefits of being part of savings groups. Savings groups do foster personal development. They provide unique opportunities to develop leadership amongst members, develop confidence and a sense of self-respect that often spills over into the home or wider community. The beauty about savings groups as well is that they are low cost, they are sustainable and self-replicating. When members become part of the group, community members become part of the group, they never want to stop. They continue to share the knowledge with other members of the group, and they mushroom and start replicating. And there is low startup or maintenance costs to set up of savings groups with no asset transfers given to the group, because we do believe that when we bring groups together, they are strong enough to be able to build their resilience given the social capital that they already have in hand. So in a nutshell, Sarah, this is what I can say. It's a high level 2 minutes explanation about savings groups, but for anyone who wants to get into more detail, I'm available to send a request for a meeting with me, Angeline Munzara at wvi.org. I'm going to post it, or feel free just to ask any questions in the chat box and I'll be happy to respond to those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angie. And Angie really is, you can hear in her voice, she has a passion for savings groups and for spreading the word. And for those of us who have worked with savings groups over the years, the minute you sort of see how they work and you see them blossom, these over 20 million groups across the world now, you become a convert, and you can hear that in her voice. So the more converts, the better. Please, check in with Angie and learn about savings groups with the rest of us. And on that note, I think understanding how savings groups are and how they work and their value is an important part of the journey we're about to go on. It's not the only part, but it's an important part. I will just in a moment turn it over to Martina, who's going to take us on this journey and really help us meet some of the people that are having this experience. I would like to ask all of you in this session, we have a good number of participants here, please feel free to use the chat box. You're very familiar with the chat function now on Zoom. Please feel free to use that chat box to ask questions. We will be keeping track of the questions, and there'll be a period at the end where we can direct them and I'll help facilitate their answers. Our panelists will also, as they see things pop up in the chat box, our panelists may just answer you directly right in the chat box, and we're all happy to do that. And they'll all be sharing their information and emails as well. So this is really an opportunity for you to really connect with these folks on the panel, and I want you to make sure that you can take advantage of that. So Martina, let me turn it over to you, and let's hear a bit about this journey and this story that we introduced at the beginning of our session. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to share an individual's journey that exemplifies how innovative and cross-sectoral partnerships bring long-term recovery to crisis-affected populations. And to do that, I'm going to show you the story of Agnes, and we can go right into the next slide. So Agnes is from South Sudan, and she had to flee in 2017 to Uganda with her 4 kids. She brought a sewing machine. Unfortunately, along the way, her husband was abducted on that journey, and she arrived in Uganda at the registration center where they put her into the refugee settlement, and where World Vision provided food and non-food items. So from there, and now the next slide, please, fairly quickly, Agnes joined the savings group that we've just heard, where World Vision provided small items like the cash box where they're saving into, and some materials where they record their savings, so that's called personal passbooks. So Agnes started saving, and when we're saying savings, it can be small amounts that can be, as small as 20 cents a week, 50 cents a week. And you save those amounts into the cash box every week. What happens is that then from that cash box, if up to 25 people do that every week, it allows you to then loan those amounts out to the members who need a bit of a bigger investment that they otherwise alone would not be able to have. So Agnes borrowed a small amount to buy thread and needles. So again, we're talking probably $5 or less. But really soon we see that more capital is eventually needed. She saw a market, for example, school uniforms, clothes for adults. So more is needed to invest. And the saved amount in that box might not be enough, for all members, for members to get a bigger share. So the question here then really becomes, where can get Agnes that money from? And on the next slide, I'm jumping a bit to the perspective of a financial institution. Vision Fund is a platform of coordinating MFIs across the world, and I can tell you, if you tell us to financially include refugees or other vulnerable crisis-affected population, we're not that enthusiastic about it, and for good reasons. Why is that? We perceive that client segment as really risky. From refugees, they might not have the relevant documents, they might not have the necessary collateral or security for the loan, which we really want to secure loan sizes. They might mostly be in agriculture, again, shouts risk because you depend on weather, animal husbandry, so all of that, very risky. Small loan sizes are needed. You heard me mention before, the needle and the thread probably around $5. So, that's not a great loan size, meaning interest is going to be very small. So question around profitability arise. And then again, we have, distances and all of that. Settlements, refugee settlements, often far away from a town where probably the branch is set up, so that all distance of going back and forth, really expensive, also unsafe if we're talking about cash. So with all that negativity, maybe let's go to the next slide to bring it back a bit more to the options that we have. Agnes, fortunately, she did continue. She did get a bigger loan from Vision Fund that provided a loan to the whole group. So she could take out for herself a bigger loan from that cash box to buy fabric. What happened is that she could grow that income. She even bought 2 more sewing machines and employed 2 more people. So how did that work with all that negative and risk shouting that I just did a few slides ago? The loan that we have given to Agnes was actually to the whole group, not to Agnes herself, which de-risks it away from the individual and puts the whole loan, to the group. While that might not sound revolutionary in this context, or maybe for this audience, let me tell you, for a financial institution, that is quite revolutionary, because we are usually fixed at the individual. We want to analyze the individual. We get your balance sheet, we get your background. I mean, for those of you who took out the loan, you probably know what you've been asked. So this is what we usually do. So here, we're providing the loan to the whole group. We have realized in this endeavor that refugees are economically active, and also they do own phones. So the mobile money avenue really allowed us here to transfers without going long distances back and forth to the branch, in the town, which might be far away. Still something was missing though. Again, I'm going back to our collective experience, probably when you registered at a bank, when you opened a bank account, or when you got a loan. I'm assuming here we did walk into a bank, right? You did go somewhere, you signed quite many papers probably, and you sat there with a person in front of you. So there's still the distance problem. What we did there is, with digital tools, we changed to digital onboarding of the client, meaning our staff can in the field onboard the client. So we're taking out the whole transport back and forth and make the distance a no issue. Combined with that, really important is the topic of financial literacy. We're talking here sometimes about the illiterate segment of the population, financially illiterate people. So again, financial literacy training woven into the whole product as a whole service delivery is really important here. So to the next slide. What happened though is March 2020, and this is an example from Uganda, where restrictions because of COVID started in March 2020, and we were really worried that, what will groups do? Will they fall apart? They cannot meet anymore. There's meeting restrictions. You cannot relocate. There's no public transport. So will the repayments fail? Hence, will the financial institution earn no more money, and hence also not be able to lend out again? So what happened though, and in the next slide, we will see a few graphs, and I'm going to start on the left top. we looked at the group meetings and at the savings. And what we found, and this was taken in April 2020, that the groups actually found a way of continue to meet. They, creatively split up in smaller groups, but they continue to meet, and that also translates then in the activity and savings. They continue to save because they save at those meetings. So the majority, 65%, kept meeting, which translate also into the 47% of the savings they kept saving. Although we also see, a significant portion where the group stopped meeting and also a percentage that stopped saving. Just a quick peek on the gender focus there on the questions with the savings and what happened. We can see that there's still saving but less. You can see the 40% versus 56, and maybe the groups who stopped saving a bit on the higher side for females rather than males. I want to move quickly to the big colorful box there, because what we wanted to know as a financial institution, does our product work? Are we completely going with repayments to zero during COVID? And what you have here is the months of restrictions in Uganda, again from March to like August, September. And then you have the repayment rate and some products. So the products here, what you see is solidarity groups, individual loans, and the savings linkage loan. Solidarity groups as loans to small groups, let's say up to 5 people, individuals, 2 individuals, and the savings group linkage to the whole group. And what you see is that from the beginning, when we started, the repayment rates of the solidarity group were always, through the roof. That's the high 90s, which we're very excited about. So then hit COVID, and you see it obviously repayment rates going down because there's hardship and the livelihood activities basically stop. But what you still see is that the savings group linkage loan product has higher repayment than the others. And then keeping in mind that the clients of the savings group product are amongst the most poor vulnerable, including refugees, or in the other host community and nationals, that is quite impressive. You see a bit of a change there where I put the little stars in June and July, where the others picked up. So why does that happen? Around that time, it got basically so bad that financial institutions choose to work with the client to reschedule, meaning you cannot continue with the repayment that you did before because for obvious reasons. So what we're going to do is we're going to lower your repayment rate and stretch it out a bit more, right, to give you that breather. That's easier for individuals to negotiate and small groups. For savings groups with up to 25 people, that's legally really hard to do. So we didn't do it. And still what you see is we still kept there with a quite high repayment rate. And then after August, it right shot up again, even without that rescheduling. So all in all, just to say, is that for product-wise as a financial institutions, we were really happy with the resilience of the product, even during crisis. So going to the next slide is really just to summarize. I want to make the point that vulnerable population can be financially included. Obviously, that depends on the context, and we have a variety of contexts. But we also have a variety of financial inclusion instruments, starting from remittances, loans, savings, and insurance. So just the point, let's keep that in mind. With that, I'm closing. I'm going to pop my email into the chat, and please feel free, to ask questions, write to me directly, whatever you feel more comfortable with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martina. I think it's really interesting when we hear about that first part of the journey and understanding how the savings groups that Agnes joined and existed in that space were then accessed by the formal financial institution as a platform to increase financial inclusion. And the financial institution's risks were mitigated, were limited by the fact of the savings group itself. Now, savings groups are incredibly important, and you're going to hear a lot about them, and you're going to hear some more about them from Angie. But as humanitarian practitioners, right, it's also important to keep in mind that the people we're talking about are still all the same people. And all the people who are dealing dealing with crisis, all the people who are dealing with conflict, all the people who are engaging in these humanitarian programs that you're engaged with have other parts of their lives as well, other financial parts of their lives, other digital parts of their lives. And as we think about that, we're going to hear another part of this story from Angie, which takes it even further beyond those financial decisions and into the community decisions and the community empowerment that can happen as well. So Angie, let's hear a little bit about your story and the journey you're going to take us on.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Whenever I hear savings group being mentioned, I get so excited. We often talk about leaving no one behind by 2030. How do we do so to those most vulnerable who are in the hard to reach places where social protection measures and support does not reach? And we have this phenomenal tool called savings groups, which is an informal safety net that builds social cohesion amongst the members who are mostly forgotten. But we can do something as both humanitarian and development actors if we work together and leverage this as an entry point to break the humanitarian and development nexus. So I'm just going to do a little bit of myth busting to say the silos can be broken. So this is just to encourage us to do more of what we have been doing and learning from the best practices from before. So let's move on to the next slide. So over the years, humanitarian and development interventions have been implemented in silos, and this you can agree with me. And what we often see is the perpetuated cycles of poverty and dependence. But our experience has shown us that a nexus of interventions is possible, and silos can be broken in order to help build the resilience of the most vulnerable communities and their children, not only to cope with the existing shocks and stresses, but to be better prepared and respond to future shocks. I'm sure you can also agree with me that COVID-19 responses has taught us that it is possible to bridge the divide during emergencies, as the world not only faced a health crisis, but a poverty and a hunger crisis. We have heard from the story of West Nile refugees communities from my colleague Martina, that COVID-19 was really eye-opening for us to see that we cannot address coronavirus alone without addressing poverty, as many people lost their livelihoods due to restrictions in movements. And this pandemic has thus presented us with an opportunity which must not be shelved, but be leveraged going forward to strengthen the nexus and multi-stakeholder partnerships. So next slide. Today, I'm here to re-emphasize the need for both humanitarian development, peace nexus, engagement with multi-stakeholder partners, including private actors, microfinance institutions, fintech companies, to work together to provide a solid solution, a comprehensive approach to build resilience of these most vulnerable communities. We need to work together if we are to build the resilience of this group of people, to end poverty, to end hunger and malnutrition by 2030. Otherwise, if we do not do that, we are going to see a deceleration of the progress that we have already made. The more than hundreds of years of work that we have put into in the development space will actually be swiped away if we are not intentional in the decisions that we are making. So it is only possible when there's intentionality to working together, intentionality for each one of us to understand how we work in our respective sectors, intentionality to identify integration points. And I view savings groups as a garnish or salt that is added to food in order to bring out a delicious flavor or taste. Savings groups, if you know a chameleon, I liken it to have chameleon characteristics or qualities because they are multifunctional in nature and can be embedded at various levels. They can provide an entry point for linking your cash voucher and assistance programming, integrate with digitization, with microfinance in order to deliver a systemic and holistic response. So as highlighted by the graph here on the screen, well-targeted cash transfers can result in millions of beneficiaries being graduated out of poverty, because that's the end. We want to see financial inclusion and people lifting out of poverty by 2030. So if added to cash transfer programs, establishing savings groups can be a bedrock for introducing financial literacy before members commit to savings together. And during a humanitarian crisis, targeted cash voucher transfers can be provided to the most vulnerable members of the group as well, to help them from falling into poverty and selling off their livelihood assets. Just thinking in terms of the needs assessment, when a crisis hits, do we have time to reach out, to understand the informal safety nets that are available in the communities, to go to these groups and to understand their needs and provide cash transfers so that it can help them from falling further into poverty, but also helping them from selling off their livelihood assets. This assistance will help them to continue saving, to repay their loans, and consistently build their profile in order to access more funds from microfinance institutions. We heard that from Martina that there is power in solidarity, in social cohesion when there is savings group linkage, when they are able to access microfinance as a group. This ensures that nobody is left behind, and it provides equal opportunity to all members of the group. Savings groups can also provide an entry point to graduate cash transfer beneficiaries from humanitarian assistance. When they are intentionally linked to microfinance products, they have the potential to lift these families out of poverty. And we see a great role played by microfinance institutions like Vision Fund, contributing to this puzzle through provision of small loans for livelihood activities, extension of payment periods during a crisis, and also providing financial literacy to the groups. And the interesting aspects which gets us excited is digitization. And we often think that it is not possible. It needs somebody to be so much educated to integrate, but it is critical, whether when establishing a new savings group right from the onset, or you are linking digitization to mature groups in order to save time on record keeping, on monitoring and evaluation. And it also frees time for the group to engage in other livelihood activities. Next slide, please. So now I want to show us that bridging the divide is possible, but we have not been documenting and utilizing the best practices of what works. And now I'd like to take you on a journey to Sierra Leone during the Ebola outbreak, where we have seen a combination of targeted cash transfers, of microfinance linkages, child protection, and gender equality education, which resulted in the basic needs of over 40,000 children being met. And 70% of these savings were actually directed towards the education, the health, and food of these children. And the communities also experienced a drop in 20% of child marriages, because sometimes parents marry off their children during crises like this as an alternative form of income. And we have seen a reduction in the women exposure to emotional and physical violence at home. We saw the emergence of the first children's group called the Destiny Group, which embedded child protection education during the lockdown. When children are not going to school, what do? Let's teach them financial literacy and understand child protection issues. And we've also seen linkages with Orange mobile money. When members were experiencing theft, they were actually proactive to request for digitization and to have mobile money. Next slide. So now, before I close, I would like to tell you a story of Josephine Makio, who is now a member of parliament in Sierra Leone, who is still a member of a saving group that was established during the Ebola outbreak and is now a member of parliament. And I hope that this will move us to strive to work together more. So in this case, we see a concoction of cash transfers, livelihoods training, access to small loans, child protection, and gender equity education, resulting in reduced gender inequalities and enhanced food and livelihood security of families. In her own words, Josephine said, "I believe every woman desires to have the right to make life choices and to be in a position to fund those dreams. Who wouldn't want to fund their own dreams? Who wouldn't want to have a choice when or when not to marry because of poverty?" Savings groups provide an opportunity for women to develop self-confidence and be independent. So women who participate in savings groups have more control over household income. This is what Honorable Josephine said. You empower a woman, you have empowered the whole household. So in this story, the members of the savings group supported 185 women aspiring for elective positions in Kenema district, and they funded all the campaign activities themselves. The social cohesion, the social networks, and the bonds that they formed in the groups provided a platform for these female aspirants to launch the political campaign and ascend to power. And let's celebrate, 20 of these women made it to parliament, and 165 of these women made it for local council, and Josephine is one of them. She is the benchmark for both humanitarian and development practitioners who are seeking to promote women political empowerment, to consider savings groups, access to small loans, cash transfers as an important pathway for increasing women, gender equality in political participation as well. So what did she do? She reciprocated the gesture of members of the group by constructing 6 classrooms in their community. Now you can see the benefits to the children, and also secured funding to construct a health facility. So we can see now the benefits mushrooming. I hope this story has inspired us to do more together so that we can listen to more stories of success like that of Josephine. So in conclusion, I just want to highlight this. We have heard from my colleague Martina, her experiences in West Nile region. Next slide, please. So we have done this during the Ebola outbreak, and now the COVID-19 situation in West Nile should get us thinking to replicate and scale up best practices. As you can see from these graphs, that from the analysis that was done by Vision Fund during this COVID-19 pandemic, that reduction in income is pushing more members of savings groups to sell off their livelihood assets as prices of staple foods also continue to skyrocket. So I would like to leave us with a challenge, or as I close with a question: are we prepared to lose the development gains we have achieved over the years, or are we prepared to do what it takes and work together to build the resilience of these communities? Humanitarian actors cannot do it alone. Development actors cannot do it alone. Hence, we need to bridge the divide. We need to close the nexus. We have seen from both the Ebola and COVID-19 pandemic that breaking silos is feasible, and that together we can make a difference. So I hope that this will get us thinking as we listen to upcoming presentations of how we can bring together this concoction together, things that we think are not possible, to highlight that this is indeed possible for us to work together right from the onset of a crisis. Thank you so much. Any questions, please put in the chat box and email me. Feel free to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Angie. And as I said before, sort of the passion that we could hear in the voices of our speakers today really indicates how much possibility there is out there, and how much this new learning and the information that we can share about this can shift some of our thinking. Now, understanding how it's happened in other places and understanding how it's happened in other cases can give us a great vision and can empower us and make us feel ready to make change. But we also have to understand our own context. We have to understand our own experience. And I think all of us on this call have had that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to sort of take that inspiration and that information that we have, and we're going to do an exercise together. This is the part of the work and the time where you get to participate. And this participation is about your experience and sharing what you know and what you've experienced. So what I'd like all of you to do is open up on your screens another window. So open up a window, and in that window, I'd like you to go to www.menti.com. So this is a tool that we're going to open up together. I'm going to share my screen. So I'd like all of you, as I said, we're going to do an activity together. And to do this activity, you need to be on menti.com. So if you can go to www.menti.com. And then what we're going to do is you're going to log in with some information that I'm going to be sharing with you on my screen here. So as you can see up on my screen, there's a code right at the top of my screen right here. Okay, and that code is what you'll enter in when you go to www.menti.com. You can enter in that code. And what we're going to do is we're going to sort of create a word cloud for those of you who know what that is. And for those of you who don't, we're essentially just going to type in some words. And the words we're looking for are when the crisis strikes, when the disaster hits, when we're designing programs. Who do we go to ask for information? Who do we go to learn about what has happened so we can design our interventions, so we can create responses that are going to be reasonable? When we're thinking about this, right, let's think about who do we talk to? And you can type in as many words as you want. The way word clouds work is you type in the words, and if you see a word up here that is something you think you agree with, you can type it in again and it will get bigger. And then we'll understand that these are the things and the terms that people are using over and over again. And as this starts to build and people are entering in their information, again at www.menti.com, okay, it's right there in the chat box. You can click right on it and open a window and then type in the code and you can participate here. We've got about 12, 13, 14 people that are coming in. And I think you'll start to notice that a lot of these are places that we're used to going. These are the places we go. You know, that we go to the clusters. You all know the clusters. We go to the cluster meetings. We go to the UNHCR. We go to the affected populations. We talk to the people themselves. We go to the communities. We work with the local authorities. And I can tell just by some of these terms and the way we're doing this, that there's a significant amount of humanitarian workers here who have done this work before. These are who we talk to. We go to the hotspots, we go to OCHA, we go to the faith leaders, we go into the households, right? But I'd like to challenge you as you're putting this information in here. Who are some of the people that we just heard about? Where are some of the places that it might be worth talking to that maybe are not showing up here on our chart yet? I'm not seeing a lot of folks putting in banks, MFIs. I'm not seeing a lot of folks talking about when we're planning for our response, we're going to spend some time talking to the ICT providers. I'm not seeing a lot of folks putting in here that we're going to talk to the local Hawala, that we're going to spend time connecting to the savings groups, that we're going to be thinking through how we reach out to the business people. For those of you who know me, I have a strong market awareness streak running through me, having done this for 20 years. So, you know, these are the kinds of things that maybe we don't see as strongly represented when we talk about who do we go to for information. And we all know that the people we go to for information are the people we end up working with, partnering with, understanding more about. And that affects how we design our response. It affects how we can move forward. So this is a very important first step. And I would like us to start thinking a bit in our next exercise. If we are not talking to the banks or the mobile network operators or the ICT people or the digital transfer folks, if we're not talking to certain individuals, certain groups, we're not getting that information. And are we missing something? Are we missing an opportunity there? So I'd like to move on to the next exercise. And that's a pretty simple movement. We're going to move right on to the next exercise, even as this continues to build. And in our next exercise, you're staying on the same website, right? You're going to put in some more information. So this is how we think about, we always want to think of what are the barriers to do the kind of work we want to do. And what we've done as a group is we've come up with some common barriers that people are facing in the field. People are facing these barriers when they're designing those responses that we just talked about. So there are limited access to phones or to networks, especially for women. There is a very limited agent network or mobile money network where I'm working. There are extremely unhelpful government and banking policies. So I'd love to do a great system and register everybody for Visa cards and hand out cash that way. I'd love to create digital networks for savings groups to connect with the social system. But there are extremely unhelpful government banking policies for that. Perhaps some of your issues are, I'm not trained for this, or I'm not convinced this will work. This is something new to me, or will be difficult for me to bring to my team. So there's a lot of barriers here. And right here, right, I want to think about where you would place them. So you have the chance to pick these up and move them in this little network here. Is it a huge barrier? And usually it's true in the context you work. Is it not always true in the context you work, but still it's a huge barrier to the way you want to do your work? Or perhaps it's not impossible to overcome. This is actually not so bad. And it's not even always true. A lot of places where I work, for instance, there is not very limited agent networks or mobile money where I'm working. When I work in East Africa, I've got pretty good agent networks and strong mobile money. So it's not impossible and not always true, that particular one in a lot of places that I work. But in some places that I work, you know, this one, for instance, there are limited access to phones and networks, especially for women. When I'm working in Yemen, this one sits right here, huge barrier, always true. So let's have a look and pick these up and start moving them around and have them sit where you think they should sit in your work and with your experience. For instance, right now, that there are unhelpful government and banking policies, for the majority of you out here, it's a big barrier and it's usually true. This is a big one. This is something that people are really struggling with. Let's see. And the population that I work with are not asking for this kind of work. For many of you, that is not always true. This is something that your populations are asking for. And maybe it's not really impossible. So this one's sitting over here. And that's a great sign. You know, that really shows us that this is something that a lot of us are open to, and a lot of the people we work with are interested in. This is interesting. When we think about this last one here, the population I'm working with don't have a lot of knowledge or confidence in using digital tools. This one's sitting sort of right in the middle of it all. This one's sitting right in, it's not a huge barrier for everybody. It is a huge barrier for some. It's not always true for everybody. It's usually true for some. And I think this will be very interesting because this last one is something that our next presenter is really going to focus on. So for those of you who are interested in this one, the population doesn't have a lot of confidence in using digital tools, our next presenter is really going to start addressing this. This one I'd like to look at here, which is the population. Sorry, I'm not trained for this or convinced it will work. I'm so pleased to see this moving and staying in the not always true, not impossible. But I'd like to show there's a lot of diversity here, right? So there's a lot of people down here on 4 in the huge barrier and usually true, and a lot of people over in the not impossible and not usually true. So our audience is really split. You know, our audience is split in knowing this could work and having the right tools to make it work. So this is a really interesting exercise for the last piece right here, that it's not always true, but it is a huge barrier. So if you have limited access to phones or networks, especially for women, you may have a lot of challenges, but that's not true in every context we work in. So I'd like us to really be clear, and this exercise kind of shows us that while it's important for us to be clear about our barriers, context matters a lot. And the specifics of context matters a lot, and the specifics of the population does. So not all of these barriers are equally true for everyone, and not all of these barriers are equal barriers for everyone either. So as we go into our next presentation, let's keep in mind how 6, the population I'm working with, don't have knowledge or confidence to use digital tools, and 1, limited access, are really important. So thank you very much. That's a really interesting exercise, and thanks for sharing that with me and watching how that's working and moving. We're going to do one more exercise, and this last one will be a bit of a change because you're going to need to enter a new code. So for those of you who are ready to enter a new code, we're going to enter one more code. And what I'd like you to do as you enter this code, someone will pop this new code right into our chat box as well. So this is the new code. And when we think about doing these activities, we've had a lot of our presenters talk about a number of these activities. And I know that in a lot of your work, you're doing some of this activity as well. So let's think about when. When do we think we do it? When do we think it's most appropriate? When is it actually coming online in our responses? When do we need to start thinking about it? So these are sliders. And on this side of the exercise, you have immediately after the crisis. So for instance, if you think we're starting basic needs with cash transfers immediately after the crisis, you pull your slider all the way over towards this line, right? And this is a later in the response. So if you're feeling like it's important, or you're doing the work of ensuring access to financial services later in the process, later in your response options, you're going to pull your slider down here. So this is a real opportunity for you to look at these different activities that we're using and these different activities that we do and that are important, as we've heard in our last two presentations, and think about, when are we prioritizing them? When do they come into our response and our thinking? So as these sliders start to move and as people start responding, let's see where we are. So right now, as these sliders are moving, engaging with existing resilience building work, people are thinking about that as later in the response. And we'll see if that changes, if people start thinking about engaging with the existing resilience building work, engaging with the savings groups, engaging with people like Angie earlier in the response or immediately after a crisis, can prevent a lot of losses and prevent a lot of slide back, which is, I think, a lot of what Angie was talking about. So that's a challenge for us to think about. Starting to promote savings. The sliders seem to be indicating that a lot of you are thinking about starting to promote savings sort of later to middle in the response and looking at that. So how about supporting basic needs with cash transfers? Where is that sitting? That's still sitting really early, immediately after a crisis. We're still thinking about that, right? It's interesting to me to see how helping restart people's ability to earn is not tracking exactly with ensuring access to financial services or promoting savings. Because it's interesting to think about people's ability to earn is often very highly connected to their access to financial services, their access or their ability to create their own savings. So that's interesting. Ensuring access to digital tools like mobile money, that's still sitting kind of close, right? We're still thinking that's something a bit early on. And I think, again, that's going to be interesting to think about that when we hear from Wes in a few minutes and about how that digital tool work can help. I think a lot of you, when you're thinking about, you know, your cash transfers, you're thinking about them in relationship to your digital tools, which I think makes sense. But when we think about it, these things can also affect each other. When you're thinking about your access to digital tools and your access to financial services, they can be directly related. So if you're doing this early here and you're doing this early here, then maybe this needs to be thought of a little earlier as well. So these kinds of sequencing issues and these kinds of sort of processes of engaging with folks, this one's all over the place, engaging with existing resilience building work and engaging with existing savings groups. I'm glad to see a lot of people are putting it in the front now. I think hopefully you're thinking about the presentations that we had, and maybe you're realizing that engaging with an existing savings group could happen immediately after the crisis. So all of these kinds of things, as more people are thinking about this and we're seeing some more responses from our participants, I think we should keep these ideas in mind, keep this idea of sequence and the connectivity of these in your mind as we hear from Wes and Catherine a bit later on in our presentations. But I would challenge you, and it sounds like a trick, but it's not. I would challenge you to think about all of these activities as interrelated to each other, right? And they may have different aspects of them that come earlier or later, but they can be related to each other. And consistently, I would like us to try and move those sliders a little bit earlier in our crisis, because we've seen a lot of evidence that that can have a huge effect. So as we close out this Mentimeter exercise and move on to our next presentation, keep in mind some of the things you've seen your colleagues think through and indicate here. And I will stop my screen share, which I will do momentarily. Hang on. There we go. I will stop my screen share, and I would like to turn it over to Wes, who is going to join us and think through and talk about some of the ways that accessing digital work, accessing digital tools, and using that connectivity can really be something both early and continuously important in the humanitarian work we do. So Wes, go right ahead. I turn it over to you.
All right, Sarah, thank you. And thank you for everybody for joining. So as Sarah mentioned, we want to now transition to the topic of digital savings groups and take all the things that Angie and Martina talked about and imagine what the possibilities look like once you add the digital component to this. So maybe we first start off by just defining what do we mean by a digital savings group. So really, when we use this terminology, we're talking about any mobile technology that is used to either digitize the records or the digital transactions. And there's a variety of tools out there today. So in the first case, digitizing the records, a typical savings group, as Angie described, will go through 300, 400 calculations every month, meticulously by hand, very complicated process. So there's one range of digital products that start with that. And this typically tends to be the easiest way for a group to get started. Basically, you can have one shared Android smartphone for an entire group, an entire community. The leaders of the group, the bookkeepers, will then use that phone instead of all the paper records, and it ensures accuracy, makes the meetings simpler, safer, all that kind of thing. There's also a second type of digital savings group tools that focus more on the transactions. So using mobile money instead of cash, instead of a cash box. And then increasingly over time, we will see these come together. Now, my company, Dreamstart Labs, as an introduction, this is our space. So we have a solution called DreamSave that is a digital record keeping solution. We also in Rwanda have a solution called Save that focuses on using USSD for every member to use mobile money for their transactions. And these products will continually come together. So I think what really gets us excited about this space, and I think what is relevant to the topic here, is there's increasing evidence that once you digitize a savings group, whatever you do, digitizing the records, digitizing some of the transactions, that you are bringing in an entirely new element that is very useful to a humanitarian context. Because when savings groups are digitized, you find that the groups the groups become more resilient. They become more connected. It builds and enhances the advantages that you heard from Angie, from Martina in those preparations. The trust level goes up among group members, and all of these kinds of characteristics that are now enhanced once digital is added to the equation, I would argue become even more important in crisis preparedness. And I would like to challenge you over the course of the next few minutes to begin thinking about savings groups, not just as an interesting aspect of international development, but in fact, as one of the key assets for any humanitarian crisis as you think about that going forward, and especially as these groups become digitized. So let me first look at a couple of examples of the kinds of data that we're seeing from the field as groups begin to digitize, to give you a sense of this. Now, these next few statistics are from a study that was done in rural Tanzania by ICRW, the International Center for Research on Women. And what they did is they followed a set of very, very rural groups who were using our DreamSave digital record keeping application, followed them for 6 months. And they looked at a whole set of characteristics before, so when they were savings groups managed on paper, and then looked at those same baselines 6 months later after they had time to use the DreamSave solution. As context, these are in very poor communities. Literacy was low. I don't think there were more than 2 people out of hundreds who had ever touched a smartphone prior to using DreamSave. What we saw is we looked at several aspects. One is a set of questions around their financial planning. Do the members have a clear financial plan? Do they feel confident that they know what it's going to take to achieve their financial outcome and goals? These things, of course, become very important in a financial crisis, because the more confident the members are that they've got something saved away, they know how they're going to achieve it, then when the disruption happens, they're much more resilient to it. So what we saw is before, just the fact that they were in a savings group, they had, pretty good numbers, 55, 60%, depending on gender and region. But once they had experienced digital, those numbers went up to 95% and plus for most groups. So clearly the addition of digital gave them more visibility to their goals, more confidence in that front. We also saw very interesting statistics around the impact of their confidence about digital, period. So even outside of using an app like DreamSave, and especially with women beforehand, there was very, very low confidence, unfamiliar with digital, nervous about it, scared about breaking a phone, all of these kinds of things. Men were a little more confident, but women especially very, very low confidence there. After just 6 months of being exposed to the digital in their savings group context, which is a safe environment with other trusted people, those numbers went up substantially. And even more interesting to me is that by the time they had used this for a few months, there was almost no gender gap, right? So the women were just as confident afterward as the men in the group. And I think that's actually an essential takeaway from this project. A third one, and this was actually a really interesting one to me, is that savings groups by definition are designed around trust and building that social trust fabric. So already savings groups have that characteristic. But once you added digital, you added DreamSave to the equation, the trust actually went up by measurable amounts in all of these digital groups. And it was things like, beforehand, I think I kind of trust the members of my group that they're doing the right calculations, that I'm getting the right amount of money. But this is hard stuff. I don't know. Maybe someone's got a side deal going. Once digital comes into the equation, I know. Like, I see everything. The phone it can't cheat me. I see everything there. It's all transparent. All the math is calculated for me. So that trust level goes up. You see more harmony in group. You see less conflicts in groups. We also had another interesting set of experiences in COVID that with our Save solution, which does digital wallets for savings groups in Rwanda, in that once COVID hit, the most popular time for a member to save in the group was actually early in the morning before they went out for the day's activities, right? Now, they still had their meetings, right? They would still get together at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It might be socially distanced. It might be smaller groups, things like that. So the digital did not eliminate the need for meeting, but what it did was it gave the members more flexibility in times of crisis. And so these kinds of things, we see building that kind of resilience that takes all the magic of a savings group and makes it even more impactful and more scalable. And one thing that we saw clearly, and I think maybe some of you have come across this as well over the past year, is as these crises occur, we heard a little bit from Angie about Ebola and some of the amazing things that came out of that. We saw similar things in COVID, right? Self-help groups in India, for example, which are a version of the savings groups we've been talking about, did some amazing work mobilizing around building masks, creating masks during the crisis. 20 million masks came out of these self-help groups just in the first couple of months of the COVID crisis. Tens of thousands of community kitchens were set up, hundreds of thousands of liters of production of hand sanitizers and things like that. And then all throughout Africa, Southeast Asia, we saw savings groups becoming a vehicle for crisis communication. So it wasn't just left to the government or to humanitarian experts. They were actually mobilizing the savings group members to say, you have the vehicles to communicate this across the board. And I think now I want you to take that data, that background, and now imagine what that looks like as we get more and more of these groups digitized. So I mentioned before that a single smartphone in a savings group environment, once you go digital, can empower an entire community, right? Because you can have a very poor group with one Android phone that is shared across the group. It becomes their new record-keeping solution. Now, think about what happens today in a crisis scenario. So we're out here as humanitarian actors trying to reach out to our communities. And we have all the methods that that you saw in the Mentimeter activity with Sarah. But at any given time, we don't know, as we look out at that community we're trying to impact, which of these members are going to be inaccessible, right? Because it's very hard to reach them. Some members are going to have no mobile, so they're less accessible. Some have low literacy, so even our communication activities can be challenged. All of those things are going to continue to exist. Now, imagine a world where these individuals we're trying to reach are all connected in savings groups, right? And have digital at the front end, maybe one simple phone. Now you have an entirely new opportunity to reach out to them in a kind of a 1-to-20, 1-to-30 kind of ratio. So for example, we talked about digital cash transfers. Imagine if I can give a digital cash transfer to an entire group of people, and I don't really have to care as much about, is everybody in that group at the same level of literacy, the same level of connectivity. That could be also through an MFI, through a loan, as we heard from Martina. There's also new technologies coming on the scenes that have an even bigger impact here. DreamStart Labs, for example, recently was awarded a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and SEEP Network to build in-app communications technology into our DreamSave app. So what this allows NGOs and governments to do is take advantage of all these groups out there in the field and deliver directly to an entire group or to targeted people within that group, alerts, messages, communications, trainings, and interactive surveys. So if we need to very quickly canvass an area and understand, what the needs are and then be able to respond quickly to that data, we are now entering an era where we can do that on a very, very efficient basis through these savings groups. And so I think as we think about that, the other really key piece of that is that this is not a brand new technology you're asking people in the community to use and adopt just because there's some crisis. This is what they do already. Like, regardless of what happens, they're going to be going to these meetings. The savings group is their social fabric. It's their financial lifeblood. It is their social safety net. So this is going to happen anyway. And if we can deliver these services into the same communities and the same savings groups that they're already a key part of their life, this can be a huge asset to us. And so I think what I would challenge is, as we're thinking about future humanitarian outreaches and programs and interventions and planning, that don't forget the savings group, but also be very aware that digital has an opportunity to transform all of the advantages we've talked about here and add an increasing level of efficiency, effectiveness. And I would encourage everybody to think about, build the relationships with the international development community that's working with savings groups, understand who those are, and incorporate that into your thinking and planning as you go forward. So I'm sure there are many questions about digital. My email is in the chat as well. And I would just encourage you to feel free to ask those questions either in the chat or offline to me an email. So Sarah?
Thank you so much, Wes. And yeah, I think that one of the things that we can all keep in mind is that digital solutions are becoming, more and more important to the work we do. But we always have to keep in mind that nothing is the answer to everything, right? And we will always keep that in mind, that nothing is ever the answer to everything, and that there are always multiple options out there. So we've heard from Wes as from DreamStart as here is one of the options that's out there. And I'm sure all of you have worked with many different providers and different options. And I see Christina has her hand up. What I'd love to be able to do, Christina, we probably don't have the opportunity to do unmuting. Do you have the capacity to type right into the chat box and ask Wes the question that way? Because that might be a better option for us just because of the size of our participant group. But I don't know, maybe we're just gonna wing it. Can we unmute Christina? Let's just find out if it works. What do you think, Catherine? Can we do it? I don't even know if we have the capacity. No. Okay. No problem. Christina, what it would be great for you to do is, if you have a few minutes, to just be able to type it in to our chat box. We will have a time at the end. We have a good amount of time left over at the end here for all of us on the panel to answer any questions that anybody in the group has. And we're keeping an eye on that chat box for any questions that come up. So, so please, Christina, we're looking forward to hear from you in the chat box and answer your question. And I will make sure it gets directed to Wes. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to bring us forward and sort of talk from Catherine's perspective to see, we've heard some individual stories. We've heard from ourselves, from the community here, about what's a barrier, what's a significant barrier. We've heard about who we ask and who we engage when we're designing our responses, where we get our information. And we've talked a bit with Wes and heard from Wes about some different options for engaging with that community and activating it. So I'd like Catherine now to sort of bring us up to 30,000 feet and really have us think about, what could this mean for our practice at large? And what could this mean to transcend these silos or these or create this nexus that this whole conference is really trying to focus on. So Catherine, I'd like to hand it over to you to sort of give us that wider view, and then we'll come back together and answer whatever questions we have in our chat.
Thank you so much. And sorry, Christina, I will still try to work on unmuting. Let's see whether we can manage that in the next 10 minutes. Thank you very much, Sarah and Wes. I'll just wrap up from a humanitarian perspective, because that's what I best know about. I would like to highlight one call to action that Wes has just formulated in this closing statement, which is, what can we as humanitarians think through when we're planning, when we're doing market assessments, when we're looking at response option analysis, when we're in a rapid onset or complex crisis, and we do plan and we do implement cash and voucher transfers. We know that the global pandemic has pushed many more people into poverty, in the need of more humanitarian assistance. You know, there's many more countries now that are actually close to the brink of severe food insecurity. We know that the pandemic is not going away, unfortunately. So actually OCHA has estimated, and this was in December, about 235 million people. That's an increase of 40%. More vulnerable people globally because of the multiple complex crisis and socioeconomic impact that we see right now. We can go to the next slide, please, Liz. Actually, one of the things that has gone through our mind, World Vision and many other actors, I see even some colleagues on this webinar, have experienced a massive scale up of cash and voucher transfers. One of the things is that humanitarian actors like ourselves have had a significant growth. For example, 28% increase of year-on-year volume of cash and voucher transfers for us. We've reached about 6.4 million people in 41 countries. And interestingly, 71% of those people are in fragile contexts. That means they're in frequent disaster-affected, recurrent crisis or displacement contexts that are affected also by conflict, by war, and now on top the pandemic, as many of you know. Interestingly, also, we have seen a massive increase of our digital transfers. That's e-vouchers or e-cash, mobile money. And with all of that in mind, everyone in the humanitarian community actually committed to increase more cash, more assistance through financial means instead of in kind at the World Humanitarian Summit. We committed actually to reach 50% of our humanitarian portfolio to be delivered as cash or voucher assistance. And we are now at about 39%. What does that mean? We can really look at one very interesting graph from the World Bank, if we can go to the next slide, which actually highlights the increase of social assistance transfers by governments mostly. And this is obviously steadily increasing. And we clearly see that the informal social protection mechanisms, in particular, the kicking in of additional top-up transfers because of the pandemic and because of the socioeconomic impact in many actually already very challenging economic contexts, has a steep curve up. It will continue. However, with all this in mind, we also see that there is gaps, there is exclusion. We've seen some examples around the issue of digital inequity and inequality. That is access to infrastructure, access to handsets, access even to basic literacy support on understanding how to use those gadgets, how to use those opportunities. With this in mind, we need to also look at the opportunity of combining informal and formal safety nets, because this is something that really can work hand in hand. What communities do, what we support as civil society and local business, local markets can be actually complemented to or complementing to what governments do with their social transfers. We also see something very interesting in this graph. This is from GSMA, that globally in the last year, we had a growth of 12.7%. That actually translates into 136 million people that have mobile money accounts, more than before in the year before. So that is just 1 year on, 136 million people. That's significant. It's still not enough. If we go to the next slide, we'll again be reminded there are issues around access. There are issues around affordability, literacy, and one of the key challenges we see increasingly in some contexts is social equity. Women have less likely access to cash transfers even, although we humanitarians try to often target them intentionally as the head of household or the household representative. We still see that there's a lot fewer women, 300 million, that use mobile internet compared to men. There's a gender gap of about 20%. We have many wonderful stories, narrations, journeys that we can see where actually this investment of cash transfer, the linkage to saving and the linkage to business training very intentionally and really digitally end-to-end has enabled many women to bounce back, to even enable their children, their girls, their teenage girls to access schooling. However, we also know that there is a very big work to be done in the area of marginalized groups that maybe are not so visible, including, I saw someone ask that before, people that are living with disabilities. One very interesting experience that we've had was last year at the start of the onset of the pandemic here in Kenya. World Vision actually provided multipurpose cash assistance to savings group members that were particularly vulnerable because of the shutdown, the lockdown of markets. You see here Elizabeth, she is a member of a savings group for people that live with disabilities in Mombasa, and she did not yet receive the assistance that she was supposed to receive from other stakeholders. So this particular transfer really enabled her to keep going, to not sell off her productive assets, including even taking out more loans for her shop to be open. This shows that with bridging and targeted transfers, with more coordinated ways of communicating and engaging between our different ways of working, whether we're development or humanitarian actors, cross-sector and very much clear about what we want to aim at, building the resilience of affected communities is very critical. Actually, as we're closing out, I do think one of the key learnings we've had is we need to be prepared. Well, humanitarians always say that we're ready. We're cash ready, we're whatever ready. But are we ready even to work and engage with our colleagues from the development group? Are we willing to really consider it, even at the start when we do a rapid needs assessment, where are community savings groups? Have we thought through that? It was very interesting to see the graphs going up and down in the Mentimeter. We need more thought around this, and every context is different. The collaboration and the pathway transition, as we call it, is very essential, but it's not one size fits all. It requires really smart programming, smart local context understanding, and also understanding who does what, the old issue. Finally, one of the issues that has not been touched upon so much in this webinar, but all of you may be very much aware, is the issue around data protection and data privacy, and people being enabled to actually share their data according to what they understand, what the risks are, but also being in control of their personal information. This is something very, very groundbreaking as a concept, and we're, as World Vision, with other partners, including Dreamstart Labs, are working towards that. But it also requires even more effort from all our sides to invest into digital literacy. As we're saying this, I'm very clear that digital and cash is not the only solution. Often we have to go analog and in kind still. So it is an inroad into how we see the future changing and how we're able to flexibly adapt to the needs of the people that we're trying to serve, to be in power and at the steering wheel. Over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And yeah, I think it's important to recognize that while we hear a lot of these inspiring stories and we're looking at a lot of these really effective solutions, that doesn't mean that, as I said, that we've solved all the problems, or that any one solution is the only solution or the inherently best solution. I think that as we get into some of the questions that I've been taking a note of, we're going to discover that when we get into the details of what people are doing, there's still a road to go, and we still have work to do here. But I'd like to just close us out before we get into the questions, which we absolutely have time for and we'll be looking at. I'd like to close us out with some of the key takeaways from our presenters. And the first thing really is that savings and access to credit are incredibly important. We saw that in the Mentimeter. We saw that in our first two presentations, thinking about how both Agnes and Josephine leveraged all of the work that they had done in their savings group to ensure that during and after the crisis that they're experiencing, they are still able to be an active part of their household and take care of their family's needs. And that becomes really important. And it can't be something that we do later. It has to be something that is active and important throughout the response and throughout people's lives, just as it is in our own. The other thing that I want us to make sure we walk away with is that cash and voucher transfers are effective at all times. When we think about cash and vouchers, it doesn't mean that if you're in a savings group, you don't need a cash transfer. It doesn't mean that once you have started running your own business, you are now independently wealthy and able to take care of all your needs for all time, right? Cash and voucher transfers are an important tool that we use to ensure people are able to continue to move towards a positive place, but it doesn't mean they're not going to slip back. And we need to have that flexibility and an understanding that that's the way the real world works. Engaging with savings groups in crisis response is important on both ends, right? It's important for the savings group members to be engaged and active in their own response and their community's response. And it's important on the humanitarian side to know that these groups are critical resources to designing and working through a response. MFIs are a partner that the humanitarian community don't use enough. And I'm just going to state that it's true. We need to spend more time talking to the banks and the MFIs. That's the bottom line. We have to do it. I don't care if you don't want to, we still have to do it. And they can really work through a lot of the systems we have, and they can be very effective, very amazing partners for us. And if we forget to do that, then we are really missing an opportunity. Digital tools are essential for transcending this, right? Wes showed us a lot of examples about the ways that digital tools, regardless of how they were designed, can be important for the work we do. And they can be important for connecting to communities and having communities connect to services. So both ways again. And finally, Catherine also reminded us that social cohesion is really critical. And I think the Honorable Josephine reminded us that as well. There was no way she could have run for Parliament and taken that seat if they never had an in-person meeting in their life. That was not a digital experience, that was a social experience. And so the face-to-face community engagement is still critically important in all of the work that we do. And as much as we are in a digital space right now because of COVID, we don't mean to say that there is not a critical and important place for this. As Martina and Angie both pointed out, the savings groups still met. They met smaller, they met differently, but they still met. And that's an important part of everything we're going to do together. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to turn to some of the questions, and I've been taking note of the questions in the chat box. And because Christina still has her hand up and was so patient with us about not being able to unmute her, even though she didn't have the first question, and Sharon and Carla and Connie, I see you and I have your questions here. I'm gonna let Christina go first. So Christina's question was, as you saw in the chat box, and I'd like to kind of, I think, direct this to Wes. So Wes, Christina was asking, she's working with programs working with indigenous communities in New Mexico, here in the Americas. And she's interested in hearing about access to digital wallets and mobile money solutions and how that connects to banks. So Wes, I'd like you to maybe get us started, and maybe Martina, you can come in with a follow-up point.
Yeah, that's great. So there's a lot embedded in here, and I think you're working, Christina, in Latin America there. So I think the first comment I would make is that one of the key challenges, of course, that you're seeing there with the banks charging high interest rates and being inaccessible, I think is one of the the key advantages, one of the key reasons that savings groups are often started in the first place. They become a safe, equitable place for savings. So I'm not sure the best advice on working with. There are a number of NGOs that work in that area too that could work with you on methodology to help engage a savings group methodology into your programs, there. And then once that happens, I think one of the key points I'd note is that we're seeing throughout the world that new savings groups that are started today are often started with digital from the beginning. We call them born digital groups, right? So instead of taking them through the process of learning all the methodologies in paper and then becoming digital, you can actually shorten that process and increase a lot of the impacts by just starting them with digital from the beginning. So I know that there's probably a lot more embedded in your question, and I'm happy to take some of that offline. But my first recommendation is engage with NGOs and local partners there who are already working with savings groups that can share the methodology and help figure out where that could plug into your programs. And then when you do that, consider starting with digital record keeping probably as an entry point on the first stage. And then that would help be the bridge for you, because you're going to need to take this in stages. You don't want to do it kind of all at once. It'll be a hard process.
Thank you, Wes. Martina, do you want to address this idea of collaborating with local banks? And just to be clear, so far as I understand from the question, she's based in New Mexico, and the organization is based in New Mexico. So I'm not sure it's working with indigenous families, whether or not that's straight through Latin and Central America or not, but
okay. Or
here in America.
No, I have to agree to Wes with the stages, because going back to my negative slide, local banks will not be excited when faced with what they perceive as risky clients. So how do you de-risk that perception for them? That is one good example, speaking from our perspective, is a savings group. So again, getting that support to set up a savings group first and get through that learning and that saving and getting that financial education and getting that financial capacity, then will make you a better client for local banks and financial institutions.
Yeah. And the bank, by the way, we didn't talk about credit scoring, I think, in the earlier conversation, but a bank, when you're ready, when the group or the individuals are ready to engage with an MFI, an outside lender, coming to them with a bunch of paper is going to be a non-starter. Coming to them with digital record keeping and credit scores and things like that makes it much, much easier to have that level, and empowers the individuals and the groups with advocacy that they wouldn't have otherwise to command better rates, better terms, et cetera.
Thank you, Wes. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think that might speak to some of the concerns that others, in the group are having as well. And it's a good setup. I'd like to sort of segue that into another question from Connie, which was was just a shout out to say hooray for cash transfers. And another was also to say, from the panelist perspective, and I will leave this open to everyone. I have a feeling Catherine might have an opinion on this one, but are there other humanitarian tools like cash transfers that you see as a really good bridge or a leverage point to connect humanitarian work and development and resilience work? Cash transfers and looking at it from the social safety net and the emergency perspective are a good one. Do you see other tools or other methods out there that are similar?
Yeah, thank you. I'm probably not an expert on that question, but I can share one of the very interesting experiences we've made recently, or more recently, is actually utilizing a development tool in the humanitarian space. Let me define that a bit more. The power of community and community that actually jointly comes together, as Wes just has highlighted, using evidence, using their joint power to actually negotiate, to actually hold others accountable for commitments. We've seen that in the space with government social transfers. We've seen this in Bangladesh, for example, where we had a 3-year project, and we're implementing that in many countries, nearly 50 globally, which is a social accountability approach called Citizen Voice in Action, that actually looks at community audits against government policies or commitments, for example, social benefits and cash transfers, for very vulnerable people. And in Bangladesh, what we have seen, there has been a massive increase through that community engagement that's constructive, not accusing government or other stakeholders of, not failing them, but jointly understanding what's the issue, what's the barrier, why are people excluded from social registries that should be included, how can we help to create awareness among people that are supposed to be eligible. And that has had a massive momentum. We had about 70% increase of actually access and finally enrollment in government safety nets after a period of 3 years. So this is actually an example where we see development tools and approaches can work even in a humanitarian context, where then the scale up for COVID-19 transfers was massively needed and needed new updated digital registries. Overall, I believe that we all need to understand each other's tools better, and we need to accept and really respect that everyone has to actually understand how we can create synergies, because the community members we serve are the same. They will not distinguish between, oh, today I'm running after this humanitarian actor and tomorrow I will go to my development counterpart. No, for them, it is a life that has ups and downs. And sometimes maybe we idealize this poverty graduation or out of poverty graduation, which ideally we want to achieve, but we see there's too many shocks happening in people's lives that actually will impede that. So how do we enable them to best buffer those shocks in their lives and livelihoods? Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And as much as I think that was such a wonderful sort of wrap up and would love to end at this very moment on time, I just want to acknowledge that there were 2 other questions. One, Rajinder in our chat box put some other digital solutions. So as you saw, Wes presented some digital solutions, and I'm sure many of you in the humanitarian community have engaged with lots of other products out there. And so I just want to reinforce that none of the panelists here are saying this is the right digital solution. The panelists here are saying you should have one in your toolbox. And you should be aware of what the options are and be working towards digital solutions being a part of what the work that you do. And so thank you, Rajinder, there. There was another question, which I think Sharon talked about. And Sharon asked about inclusion of older people and people with disabilities and engaging with them in savings groups, engaging with them in the emergency work that you do. There wasn't a specific question there, but maybe what we can do is just have Martina or maybe Angie, it would be great. Angie, if you can maybe just speak to having older people and people with disabilities engaging in your process and how that works and how you make sure that that happens.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sarah. Just to highlight from World Vision perspective and what we are known for, working with the most vulnerable and those who are left behind and normally excluded. So it includes people living with disabilities, older women, all the most vulnerable children and their families. So it boils down to our targeting. Those are our first audience, if you must say, to ensure that they are financially included. So we are not just establishing savings groups for the sake of establishing them, but we are targeting those who are in the hard to reach places. And we have seen from an example that Catherine shared during the COVID-19 response, the intentionality to look at the members of the savings groups and targeting those who are most vulnerable, including people living with disability, and offering cash transfers to that. So we ensure inclusivity, inclusion, equity, and diversity across our groups. So it's right at the start of establishing our savings groups in terms of targeting to ensure that everybody is included. So it is at the core of the saving group.
Thank you, Angie. And I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind, is that the savings group methodology was designed for the express purpose of being inclusive. And it really sort of came out of a place of recognizing that people with disabilities, older people, younger people, there were a lot of disenfranchised groups in financial access. So that's a really important starting place for savings groups, and then engaging with savings groups brings you into that community. So we're about 3 minutes over, and I know that many of you have many other responsibilities. It may be very late where you are, it may be very early where you are. So I'd like to end us here. I want to thank our panelists. I also want to assure everybody, sorry, who's on the call that we will be putting together a report here. The slides will be available, and we will be reaching out to all of you who participated in the session and getting you the wrap up. So you'll have a place to continue this conversation. You'll have the emails and contact information for all the panelists. So for instance, Carla, if you want to call Wes and talk about blockchain, you should do that. That would be a fantastic thing to do. And I'm sure he will talk about blockchain all day long with you. So please feel free. Thank you all for your participation. I hope it's been an interesting and eye-opening session. And let's take this work and this learning and the thinking we've done back out into our practice. Thanks very much. And I hope that you all have a very good afternoon, evening, or rest of your day for wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, everybody. Sorry we couldn't unmute you. We'll talk to the conference organizers. Great, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.